Hi, everybody. The purpose of this upcoming lecture is to give you a very, very brief overview of the Industrial Revolution in Britain and like the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution for our new unit on the isms, which will basically cover Europe and Latin America in the 19th century. As usual, this story starts in London. Actually, for those of you that were in class, and you can see the Tale of Two Farms drawing on the canvas page as well. This story actually starts on a tale of two farms, as we discussed in class, and as we will go over a little bit further once we get into the starts with agriculture part. It'll be all written down for you, so you can write down the same thing that I showed you in the tale of two farms part. But then once the people and everybody gets moving to the cities, and once Shaddan's poor little kids are like have to move into urbanization and stuff like that. Like London is where this story actually starts. And for those of you who've been to London, I'll sum it up like this: it's my favorite city in the entire world. Ben Jonson said, "When a man tires of London, he tires of life. For in London, there is all life has to offer." Right? And these are just some of my favorite pictures from London. I was there most recently with my children. I got to take my two boys right before pandemic. If you're in class, you can see pictures of them. I'm not going to put them on YouTube, but I have some pictures of them in London on class and stuff like that. But other than that, you can see some of the iconic views. The Shard up there, other things taken from the London Eye. You got the Tower of London. You've got St. Stephen's Tower, which you probably know as Big Ben. You can see the red buses on these slides. Other parts of London that I really, really enjoy is obviously the Tube. The Aldgate East Station just happens to be a station in the east part of London, kind of out near Brick Lane that I just happen to take of, but it's the classic underground station. But you can also see St. Paul's and the Millennium Bridge. For those of you that are Harry Potter fans, you might recognize this as the bridge that the Death Eaters took out in the sixth Harry Potter. And down, if you're looking at the bottom, you see pictures of a Westminster Abbey and Tower Bridge. And then the big thing on the right is the London Eye, the huge Ferris wheel that was there originally for the Millennium but stayed since then. The top part is my favorite part of London, which is Hampstead Heath, but that's another story for more in class and later. That's just it's kind of on the outskirts of central London, if that makes sense. And then this last part, again, stuff that I go into a little bit more in class, but I'll just kind of gloss over on the video, are some of just my favorite areas in London. Aside from that, for those of you that have heard me talk about this, I'm a huge Arsenal fan, and when I lived in London, and the apartment that I lived in is actually in the upper right here. It's about a stone's throw from Arsenal Stadium back then, which was Highbury. Now they play at the Emirates. That really kind of got me into it. You can also see the Memorial Platform 9 3/4, as well as this thing Matheny found when she was there, Dorian Walk, that I always like to show the kids, just because it's freaking Dorian Walk. So as I said, very, very cool city, London, huge city, London, considered to be one of the two most important cities of the world, that and New York, and as done by the World City Index and what controls world commerce and stuff like that. So once COVID's over, if you haven't had a chance to go, I'd highly, highly, highly recommend it. It's a city we'll be talking about quite a lot throughout the course of the year. Okay, so for those of you listening and stuff at this point, you're going to want to go ahead and title this The Industrial Revolution. And as we'll talk about, there are three industrial revolutions. Doesn't mean I'm going to lecture on all of them, but this just deals with the first part, and that's the Industrial Revolution in England. And this is mainly going to deal with how it started and why it started, if that makes sense. Because this is an example, for those of you scoring at home, of a revolution that can, in fact, be bloodless. Okay, so essentially what I'm going to be arguing to you today is that England was really, really, really uniquely aligned through a number of reasons. Things like the 30 Years' War, the French Revolution, the fact that Napoleonic Wars took place on the continent but didn't take place in England, stuff like that. Okay, England was very, very uniquely aligned for a number of different reasons. The government was key as well, so not just geographical location. The fact that the government allowed some types of freedom, that you had entrepreneurship, that you had a laissez-faire economy where you could set stuff up, there was political and economic comparative freedom compared to other places on the continent, a lack of wars, a burgeoning population, etc., etc. And basically what this did was it put England, of all places, this would have been this little podunk backwater comparatively for most of the rest of its time in European history, on the crosshairs to become the greatest empire that Europe had seen since Rome, right? because England is going to start the Industrial Revolution. This is the overarching argument in Guns, Germs, and Steel, is once you get something like the Industrial Revolution started, it's really hard for other societies to catch up until they like get to that point, right? England's basically going to start the Industrial Revolution. It's going to have an overwhelming advantage in trade and military production, and by the like height of this, I mean, because this unit will basically go from the beginning of the 1800s to the end of the 1800s. At the end of the 1800s, this is the British Empire that Queen Victoria, that the sun will never set on. I mean, it rules 25% of the world's population and has such a massive impact on the cultural legacies of like England and the English speaking world and everything today. I mean, it's reasons like that like over 60% of all web pages are written in English, right? Like stuff along those lines, like that still go back to this. So like the magnitude of this kind of perfect setup for England really can't be understated in history. Okay, so what do I mean by it was set up in the perfect situation? Well, here's exactly what I mean. This thing's going to be in Britain in the mid 1700s. It's usually historians date the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to the invention of the seed germinator by Jethro Tull in 1760. More than just a heavy metal band. The mid 1700s or so is really when this thing gets going, right? And if you think about this, and I wouldn't expect you to have known this hardcore, but we talked about this, right? This is right after the English Civil War was 1649, the Glorious Revolution, where England gets, its constitutional monarchy that Baron de Montesquieu can't stop raving about during the Enlightenment. That happens in 1689. And now we're looking at like 2 to 3 generations of that, of like comparative peace, comparative prosperity, and like everything seems to be coming up roses for England over and over again. Not to mention, they also managed to have occupied the east coast of the United States at this point, or what will become the United States of North America. They have accidentally stumbled upon, through this empire, the single wealthiest place for natural resources in the entire world. This is really going to hurt them hardcore when like they lose it in 1776. But one thing they haven't really fully grasped is the wealth of natural resources that is just somehow gifted to like the middle part of the American continent that the United States happens to occupy. So like that really is also part of this perfect setup for Britain. Meanwhile, the French Revolution is going on. Napoleon's going to set stuff up, because it starts in 1760, but it really doesn't get going until 1780, 1790, 1800s, right when, like, it would be time for Britain to export some of these, like, seed germinators and some of these other things that, like, led to farming and stuff like that. Well, that's right when the French Revolution happens, and that's right when Napoleon and the Continental System happens, and that's right when he's taking over Iberia, and then invading Russia, and then invading, like, Austria and Prussia, and et cetera, et cetera. Prussia's allies with him, so they have, like, a bit of an exception and stuff like that, but basically, like, Central Europe is in, like, complete and total upheaval, if that makes sense. And the Congress of Vienna, as we discussed, tries to fix this, but they do it very poorly. They restore a very conservative bent to Central Europe, and as a result, like, the Central Europeans don't necessarily have the economic and, like, social mobility and freedom that, like, exists in England, where there's more of a constitutional monarchy, and, like, people have relative freedom of speech, relative freedom of the press, and the relative ability to set up entrepreneurial businesses and shops and stuff along those lines. Okay, so the one country to really get out of this was the United States. The U.S. or sorry, not the United States, was England. The one country to get out of this really hardcore was England. And the fact that like they'd really only just kind of realized the wealth of their American colonies right around the time they lose them. And so while that like helped to kickstart the thing in the mid 1700s, they didn't really rely on them so much because of this thing called salutary neglect, where Britain had basically let England or America do its own thing. That like it wasn't such a problem when they lost them, if that makes sense. They have a strong economic system. They have a strong history of banking. Okay, we didn't go through the history of Europe, but once banking starts in the Renaissance, it's first like Florence that rules kind of the world's banks, and then it becomes like Paris, and then after that it becomes Amsterdam, and then after that by like the mid 17 to 1800s, what really controls the bulk of the world's banks is out of London, right? And today, like that's still even true. Like today, it's kind of shared between London and New York, but London never really fully gave up like its massively strong economic system. And the final thing that England really has going for it is that they have the strongest sea empire. And as I think I mentioned earlier, there's this argument in a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History that argues that whoever has the strongest sea empire rules the world. And there's actually a lot of truth to that today. Like the United States has by far the strongest navy, about 2 to 3 times when I last checked, or sorry, it was about 4 or 5 times when I last checked. So I'm guessing it's 2 to 3 times now. The number of like total fleets that like, or total ships in its fleet that China has. So like, there's still a strong argument behind that, but it definitely would have been true in the early 1800s. Really true. And so what's going to happen is this is going to change the way that people live and work, the way that machines help people do their jobs, the way that people mass produce things, the way they get leisure time, everything you know about society from mass production to mass consumption, all that is going to be done in the Industrial Revolution. And it's really going to be started when the English figure out that steam is really the thing to get everything going. And then after that, it will kind of continue on. This will also lead to massive problems, massive upheaval, massive political revolutions that will eventually get somewhat fixed, but not to begin with. Now, before we jump into how the actual industrial revolution started, you should know that historians claim that there are three industrial revolutions. They begin the first one in the 1700s with Britain, but in the 1700s with Britain. By the mid 1800s or so, they considered the rest of parts to be industrialized, and the rest of that would be the rest of Western Europe. Really, like there are parts of Eastern Europe and Russia, like some of the Baltic states that don't industrialize till a little bit later. But the rest of Western Europe, the United States, Canada, Japan, that would be the second phase of the Industrial Revolution, and that's really done by like the 1880s, 1890s. And then finally would be the rest of the world, some of which is still very much going on today. We talk about industrializing countries and stuff like that, and there's still parts of the Industrial Revolution that are very much going on today. The other thing that they claim is historians claim that there are three different industrial revolutions. Social scientists would claim that every industrial revolution goes through three key phases. The first one is going to be like breakthroughs in farming, textiles, factories, transportation. All that's going to mean more people, which is going to lead to specialization and stuff like that. The second one is going to be like new inventions in like weapons, sanitation, mass production, usually pop culture. This is when stuff like that becomes a big deal. It's out of the Industrial Revolution that we get like modern day sports, as well as modern day theater, as well as what will eventually become TV, media, etc., all those things. And then finally is the technological revolution, which is still going on today. But basically, if you think of it almost kind of like this Maslow thing, first you have to be able to satisfy the bottom parts of the society, the like food, clothes, shelter needs. Then you have to be able to survive like sanitation, mass production, people living in cities, and then you can get to the technological revolution, if that makes sense in that part of things. Yeah. All right, so as I said, this story begins in the English countryside, and just to set the mood for you, this is the English countryside. Okay, this is actually pictures in North York Moors down at the bottom, and then the other two pictures are actually from Cambridge, which just is this kind of idyllic setting and stuff like that. You can actually see me in that boat, sitting down listening to music on the top right, and very, very small, like underneath the tree. A friend of mine picked that from over on the bridge. But anyway, just picture like this as the English countryside, right? Okay. Now, as we talked about, England at this time is a series of like patchwork farms. Okay, everybody's got a little farm. Okay, they use it to make their money. That's how they literally have their livelihood, etc., etc. And very little's changed since the Middle Ages. You know, they'd gotten somewhat creative. They'd used a two-field system where they left half the land fallow and planted the other half. Then they moved to the three-field system partway through the Middle Ages, where they left a third of the land fallow and planted the other two-thirds. So they got them 17% more like crops. But like since then, there hadn't been a whole lot of like movement. There really, really hadn't. There'd been basically, you hope that marauding knights or marauding like religious armies or whatever didn't come through and wreck your crops for the year, because if not, you're going to be hard pressed to kind of see things out. Okay, and that's really where we are. And this thing starts with a series of breakthroughs in farming. Okay, and as I said, most people would date this thing to Jethro Tull inventing the seed germinator in 1760, and all this was a little thing that planted seeds in the ground easier. It kind of went in a circle, so that like seeds could go all the way in the ground and they weren't going to like scatter. And this led to like a massive increase in crop yields. And as you guys saw in the Tale of Two Farms, what then happens is the farmers that do well start buying up the smaller farms to create larger farms. Okay, and sadly, the people who get their farms bought up, they end up, basically having to go to the cities, right? This is what happens with like Shaddan's kids and stuff like that. Is they end up, like just like Adarsh, sorry, is sitting there, having bought up all the land and stuff like that, and he pays the last thing, and then Shaddan's kids have to like get on the thing, and they have nowhere to go, so they go look for work in the city, right? Meanwhile, Adarsh's kids are sitting there on like 3 times the land that they actually need, but the end result is that they get to the chance that they can actually like experiment, right? And so what happens is that like people start to study this, and like things that we would consider like mind-blowingly common, right, are like brought up. For example, like selective reproduction. Like somebody says like, hey, if you got a big sheep and you mate it with another big sheep, then maybe you'll get bigger sheeps. Okay, and in the course of about like 100 years or so, like the average weight of a sheep in England goes from 18 to 50 pounds. Okay, same thing happens with increase in like farm production, new inventions, new ways of planting, etc., etc. And the end result is you get this mathematical equation down there, which is really, really important for the Industrial Revolution to happen. And that is that more crops plus more meat equals healthier people. Okay, healthier people equals longer life. Longer life equals more people. Okay, and that is going to lead to the growth of cities, that is going to lead to specialization, that is going to lead to a larger demand for manufactured goods. Okay, and once you have the breakthroughs in farming, then you're going to have a breakthroughs in textiles. Why? Because people need to be clothed. Okay, and it's going to begin with like people who are able to like work out of their house and make a decent amount of like stuff pretty fast, but then eventually somebody's going to say, well, what if we put all these people into like a big like large like building maybe and had them all work together, and somebody would pay them, albeit not very much, and we won't have much workers' rights and stuff like that, but that's another story for later. But let's just say that we consolidated this all together. Maybe we'd call that, oh, I don't know, a factory, right? And that's how we get like the growth of factories and the beginning of the factory system, right? So like it's this slow movement based on like uh, social necessity, if that makes sense, right? Now, I told you the next part of the Industrial Revolution always starts with this like breakthrough in transportation. Because if you think about it, like you need to be able to move around the goods, and you need to be able to move around the people, and you need to be able to move around the services. And a country's infrastructure, or sorry, a country's economic structure is only as strong as its infrastructure. You can have these fantastic ability to produce a number of different things, but if you can't move it around, it's absolutely worthless. Absolutely worthless, right? So the prior to this, like everything moved at the speed of a horse, and that's something that is really important to keep in mind, because I don't think we fully understand how slow and painful that really is. And I mean that was really the max. And what had happened is really since about 1000 BCE, 2000. I mean, literally, this has been going on for thousands of years, and everything moved at the fastest at the speed of a horse. Eventually, they realize, hey, we can move things on water, and they become really, really, really obsessed with canals. And there's like thousands of miles canals built in England because they move things down water and stuff like that. Because that's going to be the big way. And I'll show you pictures of canals later. But if you think of like either the cut or like the area where the Ballard locks are, that like ships go through the locks and then they go out to sea, or then they come in through that. That's kind of what we mean by canal. But these would be more through cities and in kind of like smaller um, uh, um, smaller waterways, if that makes sense. And then eventually, this is going to be replaced by the really, really key technology of the Industrial Revolution, and that is going to be steam power. The idea that you can burn coal or other things along those lines in order to like actually power ships in a like meaningful way, or power trains in a meaningful way, etc., etc. And it's actually really interesting because, like, once they figured out how to harness the steam, it wasn't really that difficult. But, like, as early as even, and this isn't going to happen until the 20, 30 years into the 19th century, as early as Napoleon's time, people had actually said to him, like, hey, I think we've got this idea. We need to do this. We need to do this. We need to do this. And then we can burn coal and blah, blah, blah. And Napoleon's comment was literally like, seriously, you want to light a fire on a wooden ship and think that it's going to sail faster? I have no time for that. No time for that whatsoever. And that was the prevailing thinking. But it was this dude by the name of Isambard Kingdom Brunel who basically figured out that, like, the larger the ship, the bigger the, like, you could be able to power it under the correct power, right? And, like, we'll spare you the mathematical details behind that. But he's basically going to create this steam engine. And Brunel has the second best name in all of European history, after this dude by the name of Ulrich Zwingli, who, just because you got the U and the Z thing going on there, but he existed way back in the day, in like the 1500s in Switzerland. Anyway, so the best name you're going to deal with, Isambard King de Brunel, is really the key inventor of the day. Brunel is going to basically take everything and invent it better. He's going to take the steam engine, for example, and then lay the tracks that help build the steam engine that make it move faster. He's then going to say, you know what, let's use those tracks to like line the tracks with like Morse code so we can communicate by telegraph and stuff like that. He's going to be the one that says we could take those tracks and do them underground. He's going to come up with a theory for like the like underground and stuff along those lines. He really is like the key inventor of the age, if that makes sense. And he's going to start by like basically like letting steam out and like saying that, hey, we can do this on really big ships. And then that's going to be followed at the same time, more or less, by like Trevithick and George Stephenson, who are going to say, let's put these into like what is going to become trains, but basically movements on lines. And it actually gives you an idea. I said at the beginning, it moves at the speed of the horse. In one of the first demonstrations on train ever, right? Because, it moved, the first run was a 13-ton load pulled by a locomotive at the breakneck speed of all of 21 miles an hour, right? They went from Liverpool to Manchester. And that was considered mind-blowing. They then got out a couple days later, you can look this up, and they got a couple government officials and stuff like that, and they wanted to take pictures and show this new train. And the people had no idea, no concept how fast 21 miles an hour was compared to a horse, that like they saw the train coming and they saw the train moving and they didn't judge it well enough to get out of time, and literally one of the like photographers died and was hit by the train, right? That gives you an idea of how revolutionary all of a sudden this world's become. And it's going to lead to so many social problems that are eventually going to be fixed, but not for a large time, and we are still dealing with some of those problems today, literally, right? And this is part of the part that I was talking about when I originally was in the hierarchy lecture, and I was talking about the class issues that have always been hierarchical within like European society. Okay, but now that England's got this, they had originally the water part and now the technology and transportation part. They can now ship coal from the north to London and even to other countries, which means more productions, which means more jobs, and it is industrial revolution time. Hardcore. Okay. Here, by the way, are examples of some of the canals and stuff like that. I have this picture of my apartment down in the bottom left because I literally lived right by the canals, and I used to take these walks where I just, walk on Saturdays out by my apartment, walk down by the canals. You can see all the people hanging out in Camden Market and stuff like that. There are actually still people that lived on the boat. These now have become like, places to live, or like, some places that like, people move things down, but originally they were used to move like goods during the Industrial Revolution and stuff like that. And right up here, by the way, is the one and only Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the guy that I was talking about earlier. All this means that the conditions are right for a massive explosion of creativity. Okay, and what we're going to see over the course of the next about 50, 60, 70 years is breakthroughs in everything from Babbage and the early computer to like possible cures for smallpox, to Charles McIntosh and the waterproof clothing, to like what's his, I forgot his name all of a sudden. Oh, the knock and the stethoscope, or the photograph and daguerreotype, stuff along those lines. I mean, so much production and so much inventions that just literally changed the world. And to give you an example, like, cotton production in the United States is literally, thanks to these inventions, going to go from 1.5 million pounds to 85 million pounds in just 20 years. From 1790 to 1810, that's how much the Industrial Revolution, like, changes things, okay? The massive amount of people led to a number of really interesting things. The first would have been like mass production and mass consumerism, right? This would have been because people needed a place to, they actually, a lot of people had a little bit more time and a little bit more money, but then they also needed clothing and stuff along those lines, so it needed to be mass produced because there were way more of them than they were used to. You had production machines running like 18 hours a day, employing people for very, very little money, including kids who were sent to work like from basically age 8 or so on. As I said, this led to huge social problems, but it also led to, and you see a lot of these social problems when you talk about child labor issues in developing countries today. That's the same type of thing, but it was going on in England in the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago or so. This creates the world of mass production we know today. This creates like the consumerism part we know today. This creates like a lot of the like sports and stuff we know today. For example, like I'll go back to my arsenal thing that I brought in from the beginning, but like, you have this factory. So basically, like, you have the upper classes, and the upper classes don't have a whole lot to do, so they can do things like play cricket for 4 and 5 days at a time. Because while cricket has been slowed down now, or sped up now significantly, true hardcore cricket involves things like tea intervals and multiple days. Meanwhile, the lower classes do not have that ability. They've got, oh, I don't know, an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes. So all they really have is a ball. So a bunch of them get a ball, they start kicking it around and stuff like that, and then you get, oh, I don't know, a group of people in a factory down in the south who make guns named Woolwich Arsenal, who all get together and form a team. Or you get like two factories, one on one side of the river in Manchester and the other on the other side of the river in Manchester, who realize that if they come together and they unite together, they might have like one good team. And so that's how you get Manchester United, stuff along those lines, right? Like, this literally creates like large parts of the world that like will eventually come to day, but it's going to lead to some massive problems. When people move to the city, the conditions are horrible. Okay, they live in slums, they live in these walls that are, or these houses that are like made out of these like cheap like plaster walls that like never fully dry. So like the stories in the primary sources say that like you get home and you like lean up against the wall, and then you like peel off, and like you peel off your shirt, and like your shirt is like wet on the back of it and everything like that. They live at the mercy of really cruel landlords who are able to set up corporations and shell corporations. Yes, this is not a new thing. This has been going on for years, in order to not know who is actually doing this, who's actually like, taking money from them. We don't live at a time where there are any social safety nets. So like, for example, like when the Industrial Revolution starts, if you get kicked out on the street, you get kicked out on the street. Right? There's really no way around this. There's nobody to appeal to. There's nothing along those lines. If you can't eat, you can't eat. There's not like you can get food stamps or Medicare or anything along those lines. You're just out there. All this will eventually be fixed with a large social safety net, with the birth of the modern liberal state, with like unions and like basically like working class power movements that will begin in 1848 with the Communist Revolution or the Communist Manifesto and stuff like that, and then carry on. But it's going to take a lot of time, and there's going to be a lot of strife and a lot of problems as a result of that. Okay, so hopefully, guys, this gives you a good introductory background on the Industrial Revolution. We're going to talk more. We're going to watch a video on it in the upcoming days. We're going to talk more about some of the inventions and stuff, as well as some of the things to come out of the Industrial Revolution, and then we'll start looking at like the isms and various things along those lines. So feel free to email me if you got any questions. Other than that, have a good one, and I will talk to you all soon.